Is the Red Sea crossing fact or fiction? Did it really happen? Here's a quick overview of traditional ideas of where the crossing was. None of these are correct, as we shall see.
The Exodus account states while on their journey to Mount Sinai, the children of Israel encountered a seemingly insurmountable obstacle, the waters of the Red Sea. Most searches for their crossing point have centered on 5 sites that straddle the eastern border of Egypt, as defined in ancient times. 3 of these sites are inland saltwater lakes: Manzala to the north, Timsah, and the Great Bitter Lake. Another location, the dry bed that was once Lake Bala, has also been considered. The 5th possibility is on the northern end of the Gulf of Suez, at a beach whimsically named on tourist maps as Pharaoh's Bath. 3,500 years ago, each of these bodies of water would have been relatively shallow, ranging in depth from about 3 to 50 feet. Not surprisingly, naturalistic explanations for the Israelites' crossing are common here, including a receding tide or strong wind that could have lowered water levels enough to allow for passage on foot. However, no direct evidence has ever emerged at any of these traditional sites to confirm the Exodus narrative. Nor does their geography resemble biblical descriptions of the beach where Pharaoh's army confronted Moses and his people.
For Pharaoh will say of the sons of Israel, "They are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has shut them in."
As Israel approached the Red Sea, Pharaoh received news that they had wandered into a dense wilderness of mountains and canyons. In contrast to the biblical account, the terrain near the lakes and gulf on what was then the eastern border of Egypt is predominantly flat, wide-open expanses of desert.
And when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel cried out to Moses, "Is it because there were no graves in Egypt you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt?"
The Bible states that immediately prior to crossing the Red Sea, the children of Israel were gathered on a beach somewhere outside the borders of Egypt. In fact, the specific phrase, "out of Egypt," is used in relation to their place of encampment several times in the book of Exodus, creating an obvious contradiction between the scriptures and familiar interpretations of the story. For if traveling west to east, the Hebrews were trapped on the shore at any of the traditional crossing sites, they would still have been clearly within the borders of Egypt when God parted the waters. Popular theories that claim the Israelites walked through a shallow lake or marsh of reeds also contradict descriptions in the biblical record. The Hebrew writers refer to the Exodus crossing point as a great deep, the mighty waters, and the depths of the sea.
And the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea. Then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh. Not even one of them remained.
In the 1st century, the historian Josephus numbered the Egyptian army at 250,000 men. Skeptics have long questioned how every soldier and horse in an army of that magnitude would have drowned in a shallow lake they could have easily traveled around. No direct evidence of a crossing anywhere along the eastern border of ancient Egypt has ever been discovered. As a result, accounts of the Exodus are often dismissed as fiction or legend.
The traditional Exodus route goes down into the Sinai Peninsula. This is the map you'll see in the back of most Bibles. This idea, incredibly, came from Queen Helena, who's the mother of Constantine, and she came up with this idea by way of a vision. So, no historical or biblical basis for choosing this particular location.
Of the many sites proposed for the mountain, the most well-known stands in the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula. Each morning throughout the year, pilgrims from around the world climb to the 7,500-foot summit of what is generally considered to be Mount Sinai. Few who walk these well-worn steps realize exactly how this mountain was first identified as the place where the Israelites encountered God.
In the 3rd century CE, you have the rise of the Christian monastic movement, Christian ascetics going off in the desert to get alone with God, following very consciously the patterns of Moses and Elijah. And some of the Christian ascetics in Egypt moved into the Sinai Peninsula. That was their new area for the desert, the new area in which they would seek God, get alone with God. No civilization there, hardly any cities or villages except along the coast. And for them, they had engaged in an exodus from Egypt. They came out of Egypt, lived in the Sinai Peninsula, and this was their holy land.
By early in the 4th century AD, Christian pilgrimages to this mountain had become commonplace. And today, a chapel and a monastery stand at the base of this traditional site of Mount Sinai. Since 1956, archaeological teams have searched for evidence that Moses and the Israelites once camped here for nearly a year after their flight from Egypt.
There was intense surface exploration, and when we go to Sinai, we can't find anything. It is tabula rasa so far as the period of Moses is concerned. It was empty.
The tradition of identifying one of the mountains in the Sinai Peninsula with the Mountain of Moses was a Christian invention. No Jews were ever interested in the Sinai Peninsula with any respect, anyway, to Moses.
If we look in the Bible for clues, and we ask where did Moses go when he escaped after killing the Egyptian, we find that he escaped to the land of Midian, which is not in the Sinai Peninsula. So Moses escaped to Midian after killing the Egyptian. He didn't escape into the Sinai Desert. After all, Sinai Peninsula was actually under the control of Egypt at that time. That's where they had some of their mining operations. If Moses wanted to get clear out of Egypt, he had to cross the Sinai Peninsula and get over into what's now Arabia, or at that time was Midian. Exodus 3 says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you, that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." This mountain was in Midian. It wasn't in the Sinai Peninsula. Even in the New Testament, Paul writes that Mount Sinai was in Arabia. So where could the actual crossing be? In 1978, Ron Wyatt flew along the coast to find a possible crossing point.
The land of Midian is always on the east coast of the Gulf of Aqaba. And the mountain was in the land of Midian. There Moses saw the burning bush, etc. So if the mountain is on the east coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, and if the land of Midian is there, and if all these events took place there, they have to cross some water to get there. And therefore, the Gulf of Aqaba is of great interest.
As the right arm of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba separates the Sinai and Arabian peninsulas. In approximately 950 BC, King Solomon is said to have built his navy at Etzion-Geber, near Elath, an ancient city on the northern coast of the Gulf of Aqaba. According to the Hebrew text, this gulf where Solomon's ships were harbored was called Yam Suf.
Most likely we talk about the Red Sea as the Gulf of Aqaba. We know that King Solomon had his fleet in Yam Suf.
This Hebrew name, Yam Suf, also plays a prominent role in the Exodus account, for it is used to identify the waters crossed by Moses and his people. The geography of the Gulf of Aqaba also resembles biblical descriptions of the Yam Suf God once parted for Israel. Aqaba is extremely deep, plunging more than a mile in some spots. It is adjacent to a dense wilderness of rugged mountains. And it is located clearly outside the borders of Egypt, as recognized during the time of Moses. Two distinct possibilities for a crossing point exist. The first is located on the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, at the Straits of Tiran. This channel, 5 miles across, is one of the most popular recreation areas on Earth, as spectacular reefs and marine life attract divers from throughout the world. But the topography of the seafloor here would have made an Israelite crossing highly unlikely. For less than a mile offshore, a subterranean canyon plunges nearly 1,000 feet at a grade so steep, passage on foot across jagged coral beds would have been virtually impossible, even if the waters were miraculously removed. 70 miles north of the straits, near the center of the Aqaba coast, another potential crossing site extends into the sea. It is called the Nuweiba Peninsula.
this is probably the only place at the Gulf of Aqaba, the western shore, where you could gather as many people as the Bible states that they were.
So if the crossing was down here on this side of the peninsula, at Nuweiba, how long would it take the Israelites to cross or walk across the Sinai Peninsula to get to this location? We know from Psalm 105 that God says he brought them forth with silver and gold, and there was not one feeble person among their tribes. They were all fit, very fit. They had been working hard for Pharaoh.
If the Israelites traveled from Goshen to the Aqaba coast, then the biblical description of their route to freedom is very specific. They walked a road through the Sinai Desert in the direction of the Red Sea. Located above the peninsula's rugged mountain ranges, this trade route was well suited for travel, as its flat, hard-packed terrain made long journeys on foot manageable and commonplace. When Moses fled from Pharaoh after killing an Egyptian slave master, he would have followed this route to sanctuary in ancient Midian. Then, 40 years later, he led his people out of Egypt over this same desert road again.
You can see the sign here says Nuweiba 330 kilometers. That's the distance the Hebrews would have walked from Sukkoth to Nuweiba in the 3 days. This is the Sinai Desert. As you can see, it's just a vast, broad, flat plain. It goes on for miles. It's very hot here in the Sinai Desert. But when the Hebrews went through here, they had the cloud overshadowing them, which kept them nice and cool. I'm going to use a GPS and illustrate the average speed they would have had to keep up to cross the wilderness from Sukkoth to Nuweiba in the time allocated. That speed is 3.5 miles an hour. And I'm now walking at 3.5 miles an hour through the wilderness of the Red Sea. This is the pace they would have kept up. After crossing the Sinai Desert, they finally came into this area here. You can see this is the beginning of the Wadi, very rugged mountains. And this is the start of the canyon that leads down to the Red Sea. And this brings us to another very interesting Bible verse. In Exodus chapter 14, God tells Moses to turn and come down this way. Pharaoh was going to get news that the Hebrews were here. And this is what God tells Moses in Exodus 14 verse 3. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, they are entangled in the land, the wilderness hath shut them in. As they came down this canyon, they were effectively shut in, and to the Pharaoh they looked entangled in the land. This canyon is called Wadi Watir, and it leads right down to the Red Sea. And we're following this now down to where the Hebrews went. This is where the 2 million Hebrews camped, and it was down through the same canyon the Egyptian army was chasing them.
Pharaoh decided to bring Israel back into captivity. Then, while his army prepared to give chase, he received a surprising report of Moses' path through the wilderness. They had entered a winding maze of dry riverbeds that branched off the southern trade road in a twisting path to the coast. And within this canyon, called Wadi Watir, Moses and his people were hemmed in between walls of rock 2,000 feet high. At Nuweiba Beach, the Israelites were surrounded by mountains to the north and south, an ocean to the east, and the Egyptian army to the west. Hopelessly trapped, it is not difficult to understand their anguished cry to Moses, "Why did you lead us out of Egypt to die?"
This particular crossing point is really unique because it's a large sandy beach area that could easily hold up to like the 2.5 million people, and there's some other really interesting characteristics that made it the best possible crossing point.
At its steepest points, the Gulf of Aqaba plunges more than 5,500 feet. Yet the ocean floor off the coast of Nuweiba Beach rises up several thousand feet from this trench, creating a wide, flattened ridge that the Israelites could have crossed once the Red Sea was divided.
It's just flat, extremely flat, and very wide. There are no corals, there are no pieces of rock, and we followed that far out in the Gulf of Aqaba. It got deeper and deeper, but it was very flat all the time. And the interesting thing is also that the material on the seabed is not mud, as it is in the Gulf of Suez or at other places. It's a thin layer of sand or silt. It is easy to walk on it if you take away the water, and there would be no limit to have an enormous amount of people there. except the water, of course, but that's not our problem. God took care of that.
Here we can see a cross-section of the Red Sea at Nuweiba. It's 10 miles wide from one side to the other, a very gentle slope going down. And if the Israelites were walking at 4 miles an hour, it would have taken them 3 hours to cross this distance. Here we see how deep it actually was. It's deeper than the tallest building in the world. So although it's a very gentle slope, it still goes down very deep. It would be a huge amount of water to have moved out of the way. So Pharaoh's army pursued the Israelites, but the waters returned before they could get all the way across. Now, if Pharaoh's chariots were stuck in the mud of the sea, would we find anything today, or has it been too long? Is all the evidence gone after 3,500 years?
For more than 20 years, divers and explorers from 3 continents, each intrigued by clues linking the Gulf of Aqaba and the biblical Yam Suf, have come to Nuweiba Beach seeking possible evidence of an Israelite crossing. Their search focused on the 600 chariots the Bible says were destroyed in the Red Sea. Inscriptions thousands of years old, and the few chariots recovered from ancient tombs reveal much about the construction of these legendary vehicles of war. Could any of them actually be found on the seafloor off the Nuweiba Peninsula? Based on his analysis of documentary evidence, Leonard Muller had long suspected the Aqaba coast as the probable location of the Red Sea crossing. In 1997, he heard reports from other divers who claimed to have found unusual coral structures, some resembling the shapes of chariot wheels.
If we assume that a number of artifacts were spread out on the seabed, sooner or later corals would start to grow on them. And of course, if you have a number of layers of coral growing on something, it's very hard to distinguish the structure that was there from the very beginning.
Though the coral complicates any search here, it may have been instrumental in preserving the shapes of ancient artifacts. For coral is a living organism that will not begin to grow on a foundation of sand or silt. Instead, it must first attach itself to a solid object, where it will sometimes conform to the shape of its host.
For instance, if it would grow on a wooden artifact, the wood would normally disappear in the seawaters after a time. But if you have corals growing on the wooden artifact, the coral could have the shape of the wooden artifact. And then the corals would consume the wooden material over periods of time, but still keep the shape of the wooden artifacts.
During the course of his explorations, Muller observed that the pattern of coral growth at Nuweiba differed from other parts of the Gulf, unlike the coral at the northern and southern ends of Aqaba, which often forms large, dense reefs, some covering many acres. The formations at Nuweiba Beach are generally smaller and scattered randomly across the seafloor. Divers familiar with the area have compared the distribution of coral here to a junkyard and the aftermath of a disaster. This description is fitting, and among the strange formations in these waters, many display features indicative of human engineering.
When we dive and when we film at the Nuweiba location, we look for certain structures, and you try to look for 90-degree angles or circular objects, wheel-like structures. So that is what you scan for, so to speak, when you dive. There are situations where you see something that looks like an axle, a hub, something that looks like a wheel, and you say to yourself, this is not a coral reef, this is a coral growth on an artifact. And that is what's different to me when I compare corals at other locations around the world.
Since the earliest explorations at Nuweiba, one distinctive type of formation has often been identified on the seafloor. A slender, table-like structure, sometimes standing on end, with a coral-encrusted base, a straight shaft, and a circular top. While most of the possible artifacts found off the coast of Nuweiba are covered with coral, one significant discovery was not.
There is one find at the Nuweiba location that is of great interest, and that is the gilded wheel. It is a wooden basic structure of the wheel, and it's covered with gold, or electrum. It's a mixture of silver and gold, and corals have not been able to grow on it. It's been very well preserved. Although it's very fragile, it seems like the wooden content has been dissolved. So I mean, you could break it if you would try to remove it.
Later analysis revealed that its dimensions and design resembled four-spoke chariot wheels painted on an 18th dynasty tomb wall near the biblical date of the Exodus. And in the spring of 2000, the Discovery Media team lowered a robotic camera into these waters for the first time. Vivica Pontien's interest in this research was heightened by a discovery she had made 3 years earlier, 8 miles due east of the Nuweiba Peninsula. During her stay in Saudi Arabia, Pontien not only searched for Mount Sinai, she also made several dives in an attempt to document evidence of the Egyptian army on the Saudi side of the Gulf.
The Bible tells that Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore after they came across. So I figured there must be some stuff on the Saudi side. So I thought this would be interesting for exploration, so we did some dives near to that.
The scattered, irregular coral formations on the Saudi side of Aqaba resembled those previously found off the Nuweiba Peninsula. In the midst of them, Pontien photographed this circular object attached to what appears to have been a broken axle or hub. This discovery was significant for two reasons. Pontien had documented the coral-encrusted form of a wheel with dimensions similar to ancient Egyptian artifacts directly across from the proposed Nuweiba crossing site. Her find also provided independent confirmation of earlier evidence establishing wheel-like formations on both coasts of the Red Sea, in accordance with descriptions in the biblical record.
And the Lord looked down on the Egyptian army, and he made the wheels of their chariots come off.
Now, this is really neat because the chariot wheels give us some clues as to the time period of history of when this event occurred.
If we look at these wheels and ask the question, what do these wheels tell us about the dates and about the events which caused them to end up here on the bottom of the Gulf of Aqaba, the number of spokes help us to arrive at a fairly precise answer. When pictures taken by divers were shown to Egyptologists and archaeologists, they immediately identified them as being from the 18th dynasty, or thereabouts. The four-spoke wheels were used in the early period of the 18th dynasty until the time of King Tutmosis IV. The eight-spoked wheels can still be seen on the chariot and bodies of Tutmosis IV war chariots, but were considered to be a short-lived experiment. According to some, the reign of Tutmosis IV was the only time in history, or Egyptian history that is to say, that eight-spoked wheels were ever used. This establishes a ballpark date for the wheels discovered on the seabed of the Gulf of Aqaba, the reign of Tutmosis III and the reign of Tutmosis IV. Now, Tutmosis III lived in the time of the biblical timeline chronology of Exodus. So it's very likely that Tutmosis was the king, or the pharaoh, of the land of Egypt during this time.
Is there any more evidence for the Red Sea crossing at this location? Here we get into some really interesting finds.
So we're headed south. We can see the bent pyramid in the distance.
Now, when was this video shot?
This was November of 2016. We can see it in the distance next to the road in the center of the video.
Oh, there it is erected there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Ron Wyatt showed it to the authorities in 1978. The Israelis were occupying the Sinai Peninsula. He showed it to them. They brought it back from the water's edge and set it up in concrete, which was very nice. So today you can go there and stand beside this pillar. So the matching column on the Saudi Arabian side had Hebrew writing on it still when Ron found it in 1984 that said Solomon, Pharaoh, Yahweh, Death, Mizraim, which means Egypt, water, Edom. So this was a marker marking the Red Sea crossing spot.
Oh, and someone has made their own markings on it.
Yes,
apparently.
unfortunately, but modern graffiti. But Solomon's seaport, Elath, was 50 miles to the north there at modern-day Eilat. And so Solomon, this was his area. This was his neighborhood. And so 400 years after the fact, he had these columns erected to mark the spot of the Red Sea crossing. He knew full well where this event took place.
This
is very solid red granite. It's very beautiful. So from here, we can get a look at where this is in relation to the water. It's set back, the water's a couple hundred yards away.
And this is the beach here, essentially.
Yeah, this is the crossing area right here where the water actually opened up.
Wow.
Here.
Now, is there a definite place on the other side that we can match up as to where
Yes.
from the beach?
The column that was cut down in Saudi Arabia, the base of it is still there.
Oh, okay.
So if you line these up, it's 13 miles across the water. Here is the beach on the Saudi Arabian side of the crossing site there.
Where the Israelites came over.
Yes.
From Nuweiba.
And that's where we saw in the previous segment where the chariot wheel was found.
Ah, okay.
In these waters here, so this is a continuation of the crossing site. And so from the beach area, you can also see where the column was cut down. This was a column marking the spot for the Red Sea crossing. The authorities cut it down and took it someplace. We don't know where it is.
And what's interesting, there's two columns, and people might say, oh, well, that's just each culture had their own traditions of raising columns for this and that. But these are matching columns. They're the same granite.
Yes, they're from opposite sides of the crossing site, strategically placed, and then you have the chariot parts in these same waters. So they were placed there on purpose, for a reason. Pillars were used, in ancient times to mark places or events. And so, we can trust these columns in this particular case.
The Bible says that there was a pillar of fire that separated the Israelites from the Egyptians. This is really amazing to see what's on the beach area right where they crossed.
And now we're getting ready to head back south to the actual crossing site. In the foreground, right in front of us here, is a melted beach where the sand and the stones were literally melted together like concrete.
Really?
This is not loose sand. This is a melted beach which the pillar of fire created when it stood here. So
separating the Egyptian army from
Yeah.
the fleeing Israelites.
Yeah. So again, this is more evidence, that confirms the location
My
here.
goodness. Now, how did you find out about that?
I had heard about it, and then I saw it myself. So here it is. You see, this rock is just infused in with the sand and the little rocks there, and this is all hardened. This is like concrete.
That is amazing.
Jason here is stepping on it. It's very solid. This is a different area.
How did the locals explain this?
I asked the hotel owner was here with us that we know, and he says, I've never seen this before. He said his hotel's in a different area, but he was amazed at what he saw. So,
well, there's the evidence right there. It's solid.
Right. And so a piece of it was broken off for us to look at, and you can see up close here all the little rocks and the sand. They're melted together, infused by the pillar of fire. And this goes on for some ways.
Evidence of the pillar of fire actually turns up in another interesting location at the top of Mount Sinai, and here's evidence of it.
Then they finally come to Mount Sinai in the 3rd month, and God was going to do something awesome here. God came down on top of that mountain and spoke audibly to this enormous congregation, if you like, his 10 commandments. It must have been absolutely amazing to have been there. And the Bible tells us, says, the sight of the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire on the top of the mount in the eyes of the children of Israel. So God's presence on that mountain was like a devouring fire on the top of that mountain. And another verse says this, Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace. So what would it have been like to have been there, to see the presence of God on the top of this mountain? It must have been awesome. In fact, the Bible tells us that people backed off and said to Moses, look, you go and talk to God. We don't want to get closer to God. This is too scary. Now, here's my friend Aaron in Saudi Arabia, and behind, in the background, you can see this mountain. This is on the opposite side from where that split rock was. So the other side of that range is where the split rock was. This is now the reverse side of it, but it's the same mountain peak. The whole top of the mountain has been blackened. And this is that's not the shadow from a cloud. This is a perfectly clear day. That's actually a discoloration of the rock. People that have been up there, so if you pick up a blackened boulder in that black area and break it open, it's still got the brown granite on the inside and it's only black on the outside surface. So whatever caused this, well, of course we know what the Bible says, it's changed the color of the rock on the surface.
When you walk up to the top of the mountain, several people have, you turn the stone over, the top of it's black, the bottom of it is brown.
Really?
So there's evidence that it was burned on top and the natural color is on the bottom and it's brown.
Now that answers a question I was going to ask, and you've already answered it, because I have heard a secondary theory that this is just a different type of rock. It's a black rock that happens to have this line right at a certain point near the peak.
Yeah. But that's not the case. Yeah, this is a burned mountaintop because underneath it, it is brown material.
And on the backside of this mountain is the rock that Moses struck and water flowed out of it. And it's huge.
And the Bible tells us this is what happened here. God speaks to Moses, he says, "Behold, I will stand before thee upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink." It's interesting, the Bible says, the rock. Very specific, isn't it? I'm going to show you a picture, and you see if you can see in this picture which is the rock. Now, can you see this? It's a very rocky area. There's rocks all over the place. Which one do you think I'm talking about? And this is a huge rock. You can see it on Google Earth. If you use Google Earth at home, it's a bit hard to see, but you can see the shadow. The shadow extends. Sorry, the picture's not so clear. Now, this rock is enormous. Here's my friend Leonard standing next to it. It's as high as a 5-story building. It's massive. And that right down the middle of this rock is a big crack, which is so big you can walk through it. And here's another shot showing that crack. And that's very significant because the Bible says, and this is where if you join the dots in the Bible, you come to the book of Psalms, and it describes this event in the Bible. It says, God made water flow from rocks. He split open in the desert. Interesting. And what came out of the split? It says, as people drank freely, as though from a lake, he made streams gush out like rivers from rocks. So the Bible's saying, when God split this boulder in the desert, literally a river came out of it. Now what's interesting, if you look at this boulder here, this big rock, either side of this big crack, and you can see the size of, there's Leonard standing in the crack here, either side of that crack, the rocks look like a dry riverbed. I don't know if you can see that, but all the rocks have been rounded off as if they've had a river flowing there, but there's no water there now at all. Quite amazing. Here's a shot looking from the crack downwards. You can see it's like a dry riverbed. All the stones have been polished smooth.
You can see water erosion coming down from the rock.
Yeah, and even if you saw this and you were a skeptic and said, well, that rock has always been split, or it's a natural outcropping, and that erosion is wind erosion, well, you're not going to have wind erosion flowing down in a pattern similar to what water would create.
When Moses came down the mountain after receiving the 10 Commandments from God, he saw the people worshiping a golden calf. There is some incredibly well-preserved evidence for this event.
And here it was, where God gave to Moses the 10 Commandments. The Bible tells us he gave unto Moses, when he made an end of communing with him upon Mount Sinai, 2 tables of testimony, tables of stone, written with the finger of God. That's amazing. Here's the slab of stone that God had actually written with his own finger on those tables of stone. And it says the tables were the work of God and the writing was the writing of God graven upon the tables. This is not Moses' 10 suggestions, is it? Or Moses' 10 New Year's resolutions. This is the law of God that he wrote with his own finger. Now, while Moses is receiving this on the top of the mountain, what was happening down the bottom of the mountain? Do you remember? They made a calf in Horeb and worshipped the molten image. So God had spoken his 10 commandments against idolatry. And within a few weeks, what are the people doing down the bottom? Very sad. And it says, Moses' anger waxed hot, and he cast the tables out of his hand and brake them beneath Mount, symbolic of what they'd just done. They'd just broken God's law, which he'd just given them. Now, it's interesting, at the bottom of this mountain with the blackened peak, there's an area that's been fenced off. You can see the fence here. And this has been put up by the Saudi authorities, including signs like this. And this is intriguing because people who've been there say the only places you'll find in Saudi Arabia where they've got signs in both Arabic and English is at the airports and here, nowhere else. It's only at the airports where you find signs in English and Arabic. And it says, archaeological area warning, it is unlawful to trespass, violators are subject to penalties. And they fenced off this interesting area here because on these rocks, I'll show you some very interesting things. You can see there, and there's another one. Here's some close-ups anyway. There's a close-up of what's carved on this big pile of rocks. It looked like they've been pulled together to make like a huge altar. So there's an interesting cow shape. Can you see that? Now, if we go back to Egypt for a moment, this is a painting from an Egyptian tomb showing the cows they had in Egypt. Bear in mind, there's no cattle in Saudi Arabia. It's a very dry country, but over in Egypt they did. And here's a tomb painting showing the different, if you like, colour schemes. Interesting. Here's another part of this area, and you can see lots of them carved on this one. Somebody's gone to a big effort to draw cows on this rock here. This is Penny Caldwell. She and her husband were working in Saudi Arabia for an oil company. They did a lot of research on this. They've got a great website on all this. And here she is showing some of these things. I'd like to show you in particular this one here is quite intriguing. Here's a close-up There's Penny's hand for scale. You can see the head of the cow here, and there's its legs, and there's the tail. But what do you notice underneath this cow? Can you see this? There's a human figure there doing this. Can you see that? Underneath this cow is somebody doing this. What's the significance of that? Well, let me show you a carving from Egypt. This is the Apis bull they used to worship in Egypt. This is an Egyptian carving, Egyptian relief here. And here's this bull, the Apis bull they used to worship. And what do you notice underneath? Can you see this? Can you see the person underneath the cow like that? This is Egyptian cow worship, and yet here's a carving of it here over in Saudi Arabia, which is not cattle country at all. Intriguing. Somebody who was familiar with this had gone to Saudi Arabia in the past, beneath this blackened mountain.
So here's some more drawings Ross is next to. And then this is Dr. Kim, who was out there, went out there 12 times. He worked for the Saudi prince, and he found numerous drawings out here also. He also found these artifacts, incredible amount of pottery and so forth in the encampment area.
And he was wasn't he a personal physician to the king?
He was to one of the princes, yes. Yes. And then he found, if you can see here, the arrow's pointing to a menorah. He found an inscription of a menorah where it was actually made there at Mount Sinai.
This is just so amazing. Here's some evidence from satellites.
With regards to the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein had roughly 1,500 heavy tanks positioned on the border between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And in order to conceal them, he buried them in sand, leaving only the gun turrets sticking out. These were well camouflaged and effectively made them invisible from the air or from ground surveillance using. But they were discovered. America shifted its spy satellite into position over the Iraqi desert, and the American spy satellite, which was equipped with infrared scanners, took pictures of the cold desert floor during the twilight hours from 155 miles above the Earth. This satellite with its infrared detectors could detect a temperature difference of only a degree or so. Now the satellite was placed in position to take pictures of the buried tanks because the tanks would heat up during the daylight hours, and because they were mostly metal, they would hold on to the heat long after the sun had gone down and the rest of the desert began to cool during the night. To the spy satellite, the buried tanks showed up as bright shapes in the dark. So the exact location of each tank was then plotted, targeted on a map, and then given to Allied jets, which then eliminated them. But quite by accident, the satellite also discovered other things that astonished the military. The satellite found evidence to support the story of Moses, who led the exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt, and the drowning of Pharaoh's pursuing army of charioteers across the Red Sea. In searching for the military hardware in the Gulf War, the satellite showed up something interesting in Egypt. It showed a great desert road written of in Exodus, a discovery that shocked even hardened skeptics. As I noted, critics had said for years that the events of Exodus had never happened and were not real. Now, the red line seen by the spy satellite came down to the sea of the Gulf of Aqaba and then continued into what is present-day Saudi Arabia, that traced the route as if it were drawn by God's own hand, and traced the exact route of the Hebrew Exodus. And the sea area between these two red lines is precisely where the dive teams discovered the Egyptian chariots, the wheels, and the skeletal remains. When the Gulf War finally ended, archaeologists went back to the region to discover how it was possible for a 3,500-year-old trail to exist well enough to show up on a satellite photo. They found that a large vast number of people, no doubt with much livestock, pulverized and disrupted the sand. Then during the desert nights, the humidity rose, thus wetting the powdery sand, making it hardened like unto a concrete-like substance. And through the years, the highway was buried by shifting sands, thus protecting the trail from the elements. However, during the day, just below the surface, it would heat up, much like the Iraqi tanks, being that it was more dense than the surrounding sand, and continue holding the heat longer into the cold nights. thus showing up brightly for the satellite.
Hear, O Shepherd of Israel, come and lead your lambs. Hear, O Shepherd of Israel, come and feed your lambs. Lord, save us, deliver us, O Shepherd of Israel. Hear, O Shepherd of Israel, come and lead your lambs. Hear, O Shepherd of Israel, come and feed your lambs. Restore us, revive us, and we will bless your holy name, O Shepherd of Israel. Lift up the light of your countenance on us, O Lord. Cause your face to shine on us, and we shall be saved. Hear, O Shepherd of Israel, come and lead your lambs. Hear, O Shepherd of Israel, come and feed your lambs. Lord, save us, deliver us, O Shepherd of Israel. Hear, O Shepherd of Israel, come and lead your lambs. Hear, O Shepherd of Israel, come and feed your